You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
As you heard from the introduction, I have two full-time jobs. One is following around Netanyahu and the other politicians. The other is following around my two children, aged 5 and 3. It's basically the same job, cleaning up after what they leave behind. Except my kids are very mature for their age, and I can't really say that about politicians in any country. But both jobs are very exciting, and we're here at a very exciting time. Netanyahu has pretty much the worst job in the world. The only job I could think of that's worse is manager of my Chicago Cubs. A job just filled. Next year is our year. But think about it. Netanyahu, at the same time, he has to be dealing with all the changes going on in the region, all the threats that Israel's facing from Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, redeeming captives. Tomorrow's the anniversary of Jonathan Pollard's arrest. He has to be dealing with keeping Israel out of the international economic crisis. And he has to be making peace in the Middle East, right? All of those things, all at the same time. And so I'm going to start out with Gilad Shalit, with redeeming captives, because he was at the top of the news when I left Israel on this crazy tour 3.5 weeks ago. And he was at the top of the news from the moment I got that call from a cabinet minister telling me that he's on the way to a secret cabinet meeting where they will be voting on a deal to release Gilad Shalit. Things in Israel don't stay a secret for very long. And for me, as a political correspondent, covering the deal to bring home Gilad Shalit from behind the scenes was really interesting because, you know, my job is to cover Israelis fighting other Israelis. And here we had 79% of Israelis in favor of this deal. To get 79% of Israelis to agree on anything other than falafel, you know, it is very rare. And here, even the people who are opposed to the deal because of the price cried tears of joy when Gilad came home to his family. The people on both sides had very strong arguments. The people in favor of the deal said that we have this ethos in the IDF of never leaving a soldier behind, and every family who sends their children to the army needing to know that if God forbid something would happen to their kid, the government would do everything possible to bring them home. But the people on the other side said, well, what if you're an IDF soldier who's about to go into a dangerous place in order to arrest wanted terrorists? And you might have to think twice. Why am I risking my life here if this guy might end up soon going through the revolving door? That's known in Israel as the Zohan effect, if people have seen that movie with Adam Sandler, where he played a commando of the Israeli army that did death-defying stunts in order to arrest terrorists, and then saw them be released a few days later. So both sides had very strong arguments. Why did the deal happen now? Well, there's a lot of changes going on in the region. For instance, in Syria, there's a civil war going on. And the two sides in Syria don't agree on a lot. But one thing that they do agree on is that they hate Hamas. And they don't want Hamas to have their headquarters in Damascus anymore. So Hamas was looking for a new home. As new homes go in the region, Egypt is about as good as you can get. And so they want to move over there. So they had to find favor with Egypt, and Egypt forced them to relax their demands. Egypt needs to be looking like the responsible adult in the region to the United States, where Congress is considering cutting their $3 billion in aid. And so that is one of the reasons why the deal happened now. Netanyahu, he also cited Egypt as one of the main reasons why he made the deal now. I mean, he had been writing since 1985 that you should never make such deals, as I pointed out in the Jerusalem Post. But he said, Egypt is going through changes now. Right now, they can play a moderating presence in the region. They have an election coming up a week from tomorrow. Maybe after that election, they won't be that moderating force in the region anymore. And then maybe it'll be impossible to bring Gilad home. Now, it was really dismaying to see the contrast between the way the Israelis and the Palestinians receive their prisoners. Israel receiving Gilad with dancing in the streets and flowers, and the Palestinians receiving their prisoners with chants of, "We want more Gilad Shalits, go kidnap more people." That was in Gaza. In Ramallah, it was even worse, where you had Abbas calling the people who blew up pizza parlors and playgrounds freedom fighters and holy warriors, which really called into question his ability to ever be a peace partner. I remember I gave a lot of interviews on the day of the prisoner exchange. It was really annoying to see the way they were equating Gilad with these terrorists in the foreign press. Gilad never harmed the hair on the head of anyone, being compared to these terrorists. He came out looking all gaunt, almost looking like a Holocaust survivor. They came out looking well-fed, to put it mildly. And they had even been, many of them, getting degrees in Israeli jails. MBAs. I don't think that Gilad had that opportunity. And I remember the foreign press, they asked questions. After a couple of questions, they changed the subject to the peace process, to the impact on the peace process. And I told them, one really doesn't have anything to do with the other. We're trying to make a deal in the peace process with Abbas. This is with Hamas. And when they asked me, by strengthening Hamas, aren't you weakening Abbas? I would tell them, well, when he was strong, he didn't make any concessions at all, did he? Maybe when he's weaker, maybe he would. And anyway, this deal was inevitable. It had to eventually be made. And therefore, it's better that you make it now before the peace process has begun. And it was set to begin. The quartet was set to come and get the peace process running again. Now, they came, they left, they came again. It's still not going anywhere because the Palestinians refuse to come to the negotiating table where Netanyahu's been waiting for 2.5 years, waiting for them to come. They've preferred to go to the international community to try to get the world to force Israel to withdraw to the 1949 armistice lines that were drawn arbitrarily by an Israeli and a Jordanian general who got together and said, my troops are over here, my troops are over here, and drew a green line randomly in the middle with a crayon, thinking it would just be a ceasefire for a few days and not thinking that anyone would ever take that line seriously. I mean, probably close to all of you have been to Israel. You can't tell where that line is. When I bought my home in Jerusalem, I didn't know what side of the pre-67 border I even lived on. I asked the realtor. She didn't know. I asked a tour guide who lives in the area. Tour guides know everything, right? He didn't know either. I didn't know what side of the pre-67 border I lived on until I was looking for directions on something called Google Earth. And I saw a dotted line going through my house. Until then, I didn't know that I sleep in Israel and I go to the bathroom in occupied Jordan. Until then, I had no idea that every time I pish, I'm an obstacle to peace. So don't worry, the border is not going to be where it was back then. The Palestinian attempt at forcing Israel to withdraw via the international community has failed miserably. There's not going to be a vote in the UN. After all those predictions of a diplomatic tsunami that Israel would face in the United Nations, there was barely a wave. Now, we in Israel appreciate the President of the United States for what he did in preventing that from happening. The only thing the Palestinians really accomplished was that they really angered a President of the United States who is not known for being the most pro-Israel president who's ever lived, and ended up giving the most pro-Israel speech that there ever was at the United Nations. A speech so pro-Israel that Avigdor Lieberman said, I would have written the same speech. Avigdor Lieberman. Now, I don't see the Israelis going out to get American citizenship to try to go and vote for Obama in the election. And there's still some tensions there. But the Israelis really appreciate what happened, what he did for Israel at the UN. Now, I like listening to Israelis when they're talking about the American election. The Israelis are looking very closely at this election. I like listening to Israelis talk about the different candidates because the candidates' names mean different things in Hebrew. I mean, you've got Barak, which means... No, that's Swahili. That's not Hebrew. Blessed. I thought I heard it over there. Lightning. Thank you very much. And you've got Rick Perry, which means empty fruit. Not making this up. You've got, well, mit doesn't mean much of anything, but you listen to Israelis talk about meat Romney, you'd expect chicken or beef. And then you've got Cain, whose name means the Meshuggah who killed Abel. Yeah, so Israelis know the American election is going to have a very big impact on Israel's future, as will the Palestinian election, which is set for January 2009. They're a little late. We are still waiting for them to have their election. Abbas's term ended in January 2009. That means that for all intents and purposes, he is a dictator. Dictators do not have an interest in helping their own people. They have an interest in crafting their own legacy. And Abbas wants his legacy to be the man who said no to the President of the United States, the man who said no to 2 prime ministers of Israel, to Netanyahu, refused to come to the negotiating table, to Olmert after negotiating with him, meeting with him 100 times, and Olmert offering 100% of the West Bank with land swaps, offering him thousands of Palestinian refugees flooding the final borders of the state of Israel, alongside a Palestinian state with unlimited refugees, of course, and offering to divide Jerusalem, have the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem become the capital of a Palestinian state, having the holy basin of the old city come under the international control of 5 countries, the United States, a Palestinian state, Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Abbas did not even respond because he considered the offer beneath him. He considered the offer not close to what he wanted. So I think that the Palestinians deserve leadership that's willing to make sacrifices necessary to help their own people. And so we hope that that's what will happen in their election. Where is there not going to be an election anytime soon? The answer is in Israel. In Israel, we have Netanyahu's term is set to end October 22nd of 2013. That's a long way away. Now, it's rare for a prime minister to last an entire term. They tend to have elections moved up, but I don't see an election on the horizon. There's no party in Netanyahu's governing coalition that has an interest in going to an election anytime soon. And in the polls, Netanyahu's doing very well. In fact, the last poll found, which just 2 weeks ago, found if an election would be held today, that the Likud party of Netanyahu would get another 10 seats, go up from 27 to 37. And the main opposition Kadima party would fall from the 28 that they have now, one more than Likud, down to 17, less than half of what the Likud is predicted to get. Now, if you listen to something that Obama said in an interview to an Israeli newspaper a while back, he said that he understands that in Israel it takes the right to make peace and the left to make war. And that there's an irony in Israeli society that way. That when the right goes to war, the left protests against it. But when the left goes to war, the people of Israel unite. And when the left tries to make peace, then the right protests against it. A prime minister even got assassinated. But when the right tries to make peace, the left supports it, and much of the right does as well. And so the fact that Obama understands that and is really hinting that if anyone can make peace, it's Netanyahu, that's something that's very important. The polls in Israel are fascinating. They find that Israelis are very optimistic people. They're optimistic about everything except the peace process. You ask them, can a deal be reached with the current Palestinian administration? 23% will say there's a good chance of that. Another 23% will say there's a smaller chance. 54% will say, no way. But you ask them, are you optimistic that this new Jewish year will be better than the last year? 76.5% of Israelis say yes. That really says something about Israelis. They are optimistic people who don't define themselves in terms of war and peace. They go on with their lives, they succeed, and they thrive. Now, what are they most worried about according to all the polls? The answer is Iran. Ahmadinejad denies the Holocaust, wants to make a new one by obtaining the nuclear capability that Hitler never did. Of course, he's threatening not just Israel. He has missiles that can fly over Israel and get to Europe. He said that as soon as he gets a nuclear capability, he's going to be sharing it with his buddies, including the president of Venezuela, Chavez, which would allow him to threaten not only the Jewish state of Israel, but also the Jewish state of Florida. And that's something that Israelis are taking very seriously. And now it's up to the world to no longer play games. The international community has treated Iran with kid gloves for too long. And after the IAEA report came out incriminating the military nature of the Iranian nuclear program, no one can honestly believe anymore the claims that Iran had that they were building this nuclear program and amassing large amounts of uranium for medical reasons. I don't know why they believed it before. I think he was pretty clear when he wrote "Death to Israel" in spray paint on that missile. And it's up to the world to really do what's necessary to keep the world safe now. There's 4 different ways to prevent the nuclearization of Iran. There is the political approach, the diplomatic approach, the economic approach, and the military approach, in that order. And as you try every approach, it brings more support from the international community, as they saw that the last approach didn't work. So first they tried the political approach. There was an election in Iran which unfortunately was not allowed to be democratic. Natan Sharansky called a failure of the international community to help the protesters in Iran the biggest failure to help human rights in modern history. Quite a statement from someone who knows. Then the world tried the diplomatic approach to really reach out to the leadership in Iran. That was doomed to failure from the start. Then they tried an economic approach without teeth. That couldn't have worked either. And now it's time for the economic approach with teeth. That really can work if handled smartly by the world. Now, I know you've been hearing a lot of stories over the last few weeks coming out of Israel about all kinds of threats for a military approach. They're all bluffing. Don't take it seriously at all. Before I left Israel, I met with top security officials and people close to Netanyahu and told them I've got the speaking tour coming up. I'm going to meet with a lot of intelligent American Jews who are informed. What can I tell them that they don't know from behind the scenes? And I asked all kinds of questions about the Shalit deal and about the Arab Spring. And at a certain point, one of them stopped me and he said, what are the dates of your trip again? And I told him. And he said, oh, you're going to be dealing mostly with Iran. Okay. Iran wasn't in the news when I left. But he made clear that ahead of this, that before, during, and after this IAEA report, Israel would make sure there would be headlines coming out of Israel about the Iranian issue to make sure that the world would take it very seriously. There's this concept in Israel called tahzikoti, which means hold me back, I'm crazy. Israel wanted the world to think Israel's about to do something because Israel wanted the world to take this economic approach seriously. Because if it doesn't, the military approach is the only approach left, and no one wants to see it get there. And this IAEA report really gave new life to the economic approach. It has given the economic approach a lot more time. And you've already seen efforts to pass bills for sanctions in the Senate and the House, thanks to Congressman Berman and Senator Kirk. We appreciate what's happening there. Those bills are going to pass by a wide margin for stiffening sanctions on the central bank in Iran. They're going to be talking about doing similar things in the European Union. And Russia and China are still a problem, but a coalition of the willing will continue passing sanctions and making it tougher on Iran. And if combined with a military threat, stiff sanctions, then you don't have to get to the military approach. The only time Iran ever stopped their nuclear program was the same time America invaded Iraq, and Iran thought, well, we must be next. And so we hope in Israel that the economic approach can work, and meanwhile, being Israeli is about hoping for the best and preparing for the worst if, God forbid, the military approach would be the only approach left. I think we've proven time and time again that we are willing and able to keep the world safe. But we hope it doesn't get to that, because the world's got to realize that preventing the nuclearization of Iran is also the key to the success of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is really a fight between Iran and the West for supremacy in the region. And it's very important that the West will win. It's never been more important because the world can handle this smartly if they do things right. There have been good things and bad things that have been happening in the Arab Spring. The most important thing that happened that was good was that the world finally saw the problems in the region were never about us. The problems in the region were always about the Islamic fundamentalists and the dictators in the region who were exploiting their own people, and the world did nothing to help them out because the world was so busy focusing on the only democracy in the Middle East and trying to dictate whether a Jew should live here or whether it's better that they live over there. And the world is finally waking up and realizing it's got to do something about the other countries in the region that they weren't paying attention to for so long. There have been good things and bad things that have happened in different countries in the region. It is a very good thing that Iran was prevented from taking over Bahrain, for instance. It's a very good thing that Gaddafi has been buried. I wish that Bashar Assad would have taken advantage of the 2-for-1 casket deal that they were offering at Home Depot, but you know, his time will come. Now, there have been bad things that have happened in the region as well. For instance, it is bad that in Tunisia they've elected an Islamic government now. I don't think that was the intention of the Tunisian vendor who sparked the rioting in the region by setting himself on fire. What's happened in Egypt is bad. They have their election coming up. The Muslim Brotherhood is expected to win a plurality of the vote. We have to remember who these people are. The Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt are the people behind September 11th. They were the terrorists that flew planes into buildings not far from here, were members of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, who had been trained by Al-Qaeda in Iran. And the connection of Iran to September 11th is going to be coming out more and more over the next few months as the civil lawsuits filed by the families of the victims against the Islamic Republic of Iran start to become more and more public. Now, Israel is taking what's going on in Egypt seriously. We know that this is just an election for parliament, not an election for president, but whoever gets elected president is doomed to failure. Since Mubarak was toppled after he couldn't feed his own people, 92% of the foreign investment in Egypt has gone like the wind. Tourism, way down. And after whoever gets elected president fails, even though he would keep the peace agreement with Israel not out of love of Zion, but out of love of American money, that's when the Muslim Brotherhood can use their base in parliament to take over. And that is something that, because of that, Israel is rapidly building a fence between Israel and Egypt, a smart fence. And Israel is gradually moving troops to the south to deal with the potential of being attacked on all sides at the same time, something Israel didn't have to worry about during 30 years of peace with Egypt. And it's now time for the world to wake up and handle the democratization in a smarter kind of way. The first step toward democratization is not an election. That's the last step. The first step toward democratization is education. And there are programs that America's done all around the world that it could be doing. The transition governments in these countries could last a little bit longer and give time for the Western leaders to reach out to the moderate elements in these countries, give them incentives, give people reason to vote for countries, to vote for leadership that will take their country more into the American orbit. That's what Israel's hope is. We don't need these countries to become Zionist. That's not going to happen, but we do want them to be pro-America, because if they are, they're not going to be actively trying to kill us. Now, where is that working? The one place it's working, believe it or not, is with the Palestinians, where you have Tony Blair, who knows how to run a country. They're building up the Palestinian institutions economically and democratically. What he's doing there is very important, and Netanyahu has been his partner in doing that. Netanyahu's campaign for prime minister should be studied in schools. I've never seen a politician run on a campaign of improving somebody else's economy. But that's what he did. He has taken steps to improve the Palestinian economy rapidly, start thousands of jobs there for the Palestinians. Make sure that the people in Gaza know how much better the lives are of their cousins in the West Bank, who have more relatively, everything is relative in the Middle East, more moderate leadership. So they'll realize that they have an interest in electing moderate leaders when they go to the polls, when the election will finally happen. That was Netanyahu's plan. And it's working. They've had 10% economic growth over the last couple years. They've had amusement parks and water parks opening up in the West Bank. That's not happening in Detroit. That only happens where things are going very, very well economically. But when Netanyahu told the world of his plan, that to reach out to the Palestinian grassroots, the world leaders laughed at him. They said, what do you mean, grassroots? You got to be reaching out to the leaders. And Netanyahu said, well, they rejected that deal that Olmert offered. They really finished their term in January 2009, but he said, fine, I'll come, and I'll come to the table. I'll wait for them to get there, and they haven't come yet. And Netanyahu told the world, not just for the Palestinians, the entire region, you really need to be reaching out to not corrupt dictators, but to the people. And the world laughed at him. And you know what? They eventually realized that he was right, and they were wrong. But they only realized it when the Arab Spring broke out more than a year later. And how many Arabs had to suffer because they weren't listening to what Israel told them that they had to be doing. For me, it's been fascinating to watch what's going on in the region from my office in the Knesset, because I'm there in the heart of Israeli democracy, watching Jewish and Arab politicians fight it out on the Knesset floor, and then go into the cafeteria and eat their hummus and tell jokes together. And I think, why is this only happening by us? Why can't other countries in this region have that? We in Israel are sick and tired of being the only stable democracy in the Middle East. We want other countries to have what we have too, what we've built up by trial and error, by making a lot of mistakes along the way. We in Israel could really be a model for what's going on in the region. We've built up something very special. We're starting to hear voices coming out of the Arab world of people realizing that. There's a fellow named Prince Idris, who is the nephew of the former king of Libya, was deposed by Gaddafi. He gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper where he said, when Gaddafi goes, we want to make peace with Israel. We want Israeli companies to come and build up our country technologically and economically. He said, we need you more than you need us. You can be our model. And you know what? He's right. We are the model in the Middle East, whether they're looking at us or not. We've really become, or we're striving to become, let's put it that way, the light unto the nations that the prophet Isaiah, and a few years after that, David Ben-Gurion, said we would be. We're saving lives around the world, from Haiti to Japan to Turkey. We are winning Nobel Prizes. We just got our 10th Nobel Prize. We got that Nobel Minion. One of the highest projected, Nobels per capita out of any country in the world. The country that has the most is Sweden. Who gives the most? Who gives out the Nobel Prize? Sweden. They don't count. You know, we invented so many of the things that you use here every day, the wireless internet and instant messaging and text messaging and the voicemail. You know, we're very proud of what we've accomplished in Israel. We're proud of our economy. Highest projected economic growth for the coming year. We've avoided the international economic crisis. We have a 30-year record low in unemployment right now, 5.5%. I hope that happens soon in my wife's native Michigan. I give briefings to the credit agencies when they come to Israel, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's. Shortly after I briefed Standard & Poor's this summer, they raised Israel's credit rating right after they had lowered America's. Now, we're not letting it go to our heads. We're proud that we're the only country in the world that had its credit rating raised. We know in Israel we've got a long way to go. They lowered America's credit rating to AA+. We're at 1A+. America's still a few steps ahead of Israel and everything. And there are signs that things in America are going to get better economically as well. I want to end with telling you about this fascinating study by the Martin Institute that was published in The Atlantic a few weeks ago. It was a study of more than 90 countries and their potential for sustainable prosperity, long-term economic indicators. And it found that the people who are saying that the countries that are on the way up are Russia, China, India, Brazil, and the countries on the way down, including the United States, are actually wrong. That those countries aren't as doing as well as people think, and that America isn't doing as badly as people think when it comes to the long-term indicators that really matter. It found that the only countries that are really ahead of the United States are Finland at number 1, thank you Nokia, and Japan at number 2, thank you Sony. That America was number 3 on the list out of 90 countries around the world. What country was number 4? Tell you a little secret. It was little old Israel. And that gives me a lot of hope for the future. That things in Israel are going to get better and better and better. That things in the region could get better if the world handles things smartly. And that things are also going to be getting better in America. Thank you very much. Gilo is the largest neighborhood in Jerusalem. The people who live there are mostly secular. It was built in the 70s, a long time ago. And no one who lives there ever thought they would ever be called a settlement. You know, Israel annexed the West Bank, annexed the eastern half of Jerusalem in June of 1967 and never looked back. And when they heard the President of the United States, in an interview with Fox in China, call Gilo a settlement, Israelis were blown away. Har Choma, that was built recently by Netanyahu the first time as prime minister. Har Choma was the one Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem that the Palestinians didn't agree to give Israel in the talks between Olmert and Abu Mazen and Abbas. But Gilo, of course he did. You know, the Palestinians didn't give up much in those negotiations, but Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem, other than Har Choma, they did. They said, of course Gilo is going to be part of Israel forever. It was Obama that put it on the table. And in doing so, he went against the Israeli left. There are different approaches that presidents have taken. There are presidents who have decided to try to reach out to all Israelis at the same time, make everybody like you, try to appeal to all the people all the time. That could work sometimes, sometimes not. There are American presidents who've tried the strategy of divide and conquer. Reach out to only half the Israelis and the other half won't like you and you don't care. What Obama did was he went against the people who could have liked him. He didn't put the focus on the settlements outside the settlement blocks like Clinton and Bush did. Clinton and Bush said Israel could build in the settlements, but they can't build outside the blocks. Because that way you won't affect the final borders of the state of Israel. You won't affect the final borders of the Palestinian state as long as you build only inside the blocks and you can't expand them. That's a way of going against the right that wants to build outside the blocks. That's not what Obama did. He went against the blocks. That goes against the centrist Israelis who say, Gush Etzion, Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, these places have to be part of Israel forever. He went against centrist Israelis that way. And he went one step further. By calling Gilo a settlement, he went against leftist Israelis who believe that we shouldn't be building in the West Bank at all because you got to be strengthening Jerusalem. And so he went against them. That's how you end up having polls that say that Obama's so unpopular in Israel, because the right that wouldn't have liked him anyway, and the center is disappointed in him, and the left is really angry with him. That's what ended up happening. So Gilo and Har Choma are going to be part of Israel forever. And I don't see another American president falling into that kind of puddle again, because that kind of step ensured that there would be no peace process. There has been an attempt by Obama to reach out to Israel again. The speech in September was very good. He didn't know that the microphone was on when he said what he said about Netanyahu to Sarkozy about, I have to deal with him every day. Things are going all right now. I mean, when that report came out about what Sarkozy and Obama had said about Netanyahu, the reaction from Netanyahu's office was very telling, Barbara. The response was, did you know that in that same conversation that Obama was actually criticizing Sarkozy for having France vote in favor of creating a Palestinian state at UNESCO? Like, all Netanyahu would say about Obama was something positive, because he really, really wants to get along with him. Now, whether he's good for the Jews, look, Jews vote on a lot of issues. I know Jews don't vote only on Israel. And on other issues, I'm not an expert. And I don't know who's good for the Jews in America and who's not. I mean, I vote only on Israel. I vote in Israel in American elections. And I can tell you that my vote in the last election went to Obama. Now, does that mean anything? No, because I vote in the state of Illinois. And so I'm not telling you who I voted for. I'm telling you who my vote went to. I could have written Donald Duck on the ballot, and it would have gone to Obama. That's just the way your American political system, that's the way it works. And so if your question is, what do Israelis think about the President of the United States? I have been monitoring that subject very closely over the last 2 years. I've been taking polls. And the first poll we took was back in May of 2009. We asked Israelis, is Obama more pro-Israel, more pro-Palestinian, or neutral? In that poll, Obama did quite well. 31% of Israelis said that Obama was pro-Israel. 14% said he was more pro-Palestinian. 40% said he was neutral. That was in May 2009, before he really did anything in the Middle East. Then came June. In June, he went to Cairo. He, depending on how you interpret it, compared what the Palestinians had been through to the Holocaust. He had a meeting with Netanyahu where he revealed an obsession with settlements that would prevent there from being a peace process. And his numbers went down, in part because of what I told you about losing the center and the left by really going against them with full force, instead of going against the Israeli right. And so the numbers changed within 3 weeks. We took another poll, asked the same question, and the percentage saying that Obama was more pro-Palestinian went up from 14% to 50%. The percentage saying he's more pro-Israel went down from 31% to only 6%. That was in June 2009. That headline made news all around the world. Obama's advisors saw this. They said, we've lost mainstream Israel. We can't allow this number to get any lower. And in fact, it did. In August, it fell to only 4%, which, if you think about it, is almost mathematically impossible. The poll had a margin of error of 4.5%. That meant that there were people who hadn't even been born yet who had a problem with the President of the United States. Now, since then, it went up little by little. It went up to 10% and then up to 12%. After the speech in the UN, it went up to 54%. 54% of Israelis saying that Obama is more pro-Israel than pro-Palestinian. That was the last poll I took. I don't know where it is right now. I'd be very interested to know. So the answer to your question about what Israelis think about Obama right now at this very moment, I have no idea. The question was about how Israel will deal with the Muslim Brotherhood taking over more countries in the region. And right now, Israel has tried to warn countries, the leading nations of the world, that this doesn't have to happen, that the world can intervene. I want to tell you about Tzipi Livni's trip around the world. Okay, Tzipi Livni, former foreign minister, respected around the world, sometimes more than in Israel. She, at a certain point, in the beginning of the Arab Spring, went to some leading nations in the world and told them, you don't have to let the Muslim Brotherhood run. And they looked at her funny. What do you mean? These are going to be democracies in the region. And she said, most democracies have rules about what parties could run. In Europe, many countries, fascist parties are not allowed to run. In Israel, Rabbi Kahana was prevented from running. And you don't have to go too far in setting criteria. Just set two rules. Number one, for a party to run in an election, they have to be against murdering their own people. Not too much to ask for. And number two, for them to be able to run in an election, they have to be in favor of there being another election eventually. Those were the two criteria she tried to convince the world to pressure the Muslim and Arab world to adopt, and she failed. They said, no, we don't have to do that. Now, if they would have done that, the Muslim Brotherhood could have run on either count. That's what they should have done. Now, so after that didn't work, Israel's still trying to persuade the world to delay elections, to not hurry so much, to have more outreach, to give people alternatives to the Muslim Brotherhood, allow more moderate parties to develop themselves, because the Muslim Brotherhood, they're a lot more organized because they got the network of mosques and everything. The world's still not listening. And it's up to Israel to, meanwhile, just be ready defensively, to be on guard. And that's all we can do, because we know the region's going to become more dangerous. I had a member of Knesset on the right say, the Arab Spring is a great thing for Israel, because he said America and the rest of the world will see that the region will get more dangerous, and that Israel's the only country they can really rely on. That's a nice way of putting it, putting a silver lining on a very dark cloud, that America will see we are really their only ally in the region. So Lester's question is about the economic protests in Israel this summer. People thought that your protesters in the tents and the Occupy movement here were modeled after the Arab Spring. Not true. They were modeled after the Israeli summer. The protesters here, they're not asking for freedom. You got that over here. And, so that's not like what the Arab Spring was. They're asking for better economic conditions, just like the protesters were in Israel, except in Israel, the protesters were demonstrating because they were upset that our economy is too good. Yep. They were saying, if our economy is doing so well, why isn't it trickling down to me? This is a product of something very rare that we had in Israel at the beginning of the summer. We had a news vacuum. That doesn't happen a lot. When there's a security situation, Israelis don't think about themselves. They realize they're part of a collective and you have to make sacrifices. When you've got nothing going on, people can start thinking, hey, wait a second. Why do I have so little in my pockets? Why do I have less than zero in the bank? We're allowed to do that in Israel. And you ended up having 400,000 people protesting on the streets, demanding that something be done to stop the high cost of living, especially the extremely high cost of buying a home in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. And what did the government do? Did it do what other countries did in the region? There were protesters on the streets and shoot at them? No. They decided to appoint a team of the top 16 economic experts in the country to try to solve their legitimate concerns that they raised. And what did the protesters then do? They appointed a team of their own experts to respond to the experts of the government. That's the Israeli chutzpah, you know? And now, as we speak, some of these recommendations about lowering the cost of public transportation and what? No, cottage cheese was a separate rebellion. If you want to ask about that, you can. That actually had nothing. This is different. The cottage cheese rebellion was started by ultra-Orthodox a couple months before the protests in the streets began. And the ultra-Orthodox did not participate in these protests in the streets. Entirely separate. The cottage cheese protesters, their protest ended when they lowered the cost of cottage cheese and raised the cost of other things. But you know, that's not one where the government intervened, as opposed to this. You're two separate protests. So this protest, you know, this was about the high cost of living, and so the government has been lowering the cost of public transportation, all kinds of initiatives to build more in the Negev and the Galilee, to give incentives to people to build there, to contractors to build quicker at a lower cost, smaller apartments for families just getting their start. And also, one of the most important recommendations of the committee Netanyahu appointed is to make education for children be free from age 3 instead of age 5, and have discounts already from the time maternity leave ends at 3 months. Discounts on childcare. As the father of a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, I really appreciate what the government is doing. And so it's going to take some time to implement these changes. The Knesset was on recess the entire summer, so it couldn't start implementing anything. You know, in the summer it's hot, and you don't want to work when it's hot. And then came September, and there are holidays in September. You can't work that month. In October, there were holidays too, and you need time to recover from those holidays. So the Knesset actually didn't get back to session until October 31st. Good thing nobody told them about Halloween. But now they're finally there, and they're working to fix the legitimate problems raised by the protesters. Millie's question is about Palestinian refugees. Now, to remember that according to the United Nations, the United Nations has a different definition of refugee than it does for a Palestinian refugee. A refugee is someone who's expelled from his land under duress and forced to move to another country. That's not what a Palestinian refugee is. According to the UN, a Palestinian refugee is any Arab who lived in the current borders of the State of Israel before 1948, who left willingly or unwillingly, their children and grandchildren ad infinitum. So how many refugees are there among the Palestinians still alive today? Maybe a few hundred. How many Palestinian refugees are there according to the UN? 11 million. There's not enough room for them in Gaza, you're right. There's not enough room for them in Israel either. There are 7 million people living in Israel today. 75% of them are Jewish. 20% of them are Arab Muslim. 5% of them are other. Now, if you have 11 million hostile Arabs move to the final borders of the State of Israel, you don't have a Jewish state anymore. You have another Arab state, 58th Muslim state is what you end up having. Now, that is something that Israelis unite against happening. Even Olmert's plan, at the time that he discussed with Abbas, he was accepting a limited number of Palestinian refugees according to family reunification, but that's it. And not according to the law of return, because there were just as many Jews expelled from Arab and Muslim countries when the State of Israel was founded as there were Arabs who fled the nascent Jewish state. And that's something that Israel has tried to impress upon the world, and I think they're understanding it more. Other leaders still have more time to go. When Israelis heard the speech that the President of the United States gave on the 19th of May at the State Department, the day before Netanyahu came and he announced the Middle East plan, I know that American Jews made a big deal out of him saying something about the pre-67 borders. That wasn't as big a deal in Israel. Netanyahu said the same thing 3 days before, using a different euphemism in the Knesset. The problem with that speech was that Obama's plan was that the sequence would be, first, he would deal with the border issue and security. And Jerusalem and refugees would be last, he said. And what that means is that Israel would have to give everything up in advance. The border issue is where Israel gives stuff up. The Palestinians are supposed to give something up on the refugee issue, namely these 11 million people. So what the President of the United States was asking for was for Israel to give everything up in advance in hopes that the Palestinians would give something up later on that they've said they would never give up. That would kill us. That was the problem. And that is something that makes it harder for there to be a peace process in the future, because that is something, that sequence was something the Palestinians never asked for in negotiations. It had never happened before. And since that speech, they are demanding it as a precondition for talks. That makes things harder. Larry, I appreciate you asking about Jonathan Pollard. You know, I've written more about Jonathan Pollard over the last 2 years than anybody else has. It's not on my beat. I cover Israeli politics, but no one was covering it, and I felt someone needed to. And I've thought it's very interesting, because here you have a guy who was arrested 26 years ago tomorrow, who has been serving a life sentence for passing classified information to an ally when no one ever convicted of that crime has gotten more than 5 years. A man who did not have a fair trial, who never got an appeal, because his Lebanese lawyer, who currently works for the Palestinian Authority, forgot to file the paperwork, who got screwed over by an American Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, who was a self-hating non-Jew with a Jewish name, and who illegally interfered in the case. And there are efforts over the last couple years to try to raise awareness. There's been momentum to try to get him free. A long list of very senior current and former American Israeli officials have come out urging the President of the United States to grant him clemency, not a pardon. Pardons are for people that didn't do anything wrong. He did something wrong. We're talking about commuting a sentence to time served. Netanyahu has asked for it officially. There's no legal recourse. The only way that he will ever see the light of day is if the President of the United States sets him free. That's what's going on. And I'm supposed to write another follow-up tomorrow because it's the anniversary. And stay tuned in the Jerusalem Post to see more information on him. If you want to read a long story I wrote about him, Google Gil Hoffman and Pollard's plight. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.